Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you.
Hi, I'm Helen Leathers, and with me today is my business partner and co-host, Tom Dillon. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Helen. How are you?
I am good, thank you. How are you?
I am wonderfully well.
Brilliant. Well, what have we got in store for our listeners today?
Today we are talking about an approach to coaching, and the approach we're talking about is somatic coaching.
Oh, lovely. I like this topic.
Good.
So let's start with a description. How would you describe somatic coaching for our listeners?
Well, soma is the Greek word for body, so it's definitely literal translation, I guess, is body coaching, but we're not necessarily coaching the body. We're using the body within our coaching. So it's a holistic approach that has that intention of perhaps raising a coachee's awareness of their body and the messages that are coming from their body. So it's definitely sort of introducing them to their body and getting them to reflect on aspects of their physiology that could be useful to them in working out whatever is right for them.
So that mind-body connection link.
Yes.
And I think this is super important for people. I think we've become very in our own heads, haven't we?
Yeah, and I was talking in conversation with someone or listening to a podcast, but someone somewhere has been talking about this recently, and they were saying that if we had just somatic coaching, if that had been the type of coaching that everyone did, and then someone introduced the idea of cognitive coaching, thinking about thinking, people would be really amazed. And when actually it makes perfect sense for the two to exist. And
I'd never thought of it that way around.
Yeah. But it's funny that it seems there's almost a resistance to somatic coaching because it's not about thinking. And I think about my introduction to coaching, and it was very much about the conversation, the exchange of words. And so I think the person-centered approach of talking things through is my notion of coaching. And actually, when I was first introduced to the concept of somatic coaching, embodied coaching, I didn't really get it. So on my master's program, when I was studying, the tutor was very engaged with somatic coaching. She'd been to California to do a week's residential on somatic coaching. And I was like, yeah, I don't really get it. And so I read the book that was written by the guy that she'd been to California to see and spent a week with, Richard Strozzi Heckler, and The Art of Somatic Coaching. And I thought, yeah, I don't get it. It's a really strange. So his whole idea was a whole lifestyle. So he introduced elements of Aikido, and it was almost like you had to learn Aikido in order to be a somatic coach. So you could then teach those patterns to your coachee. I thought, no, this isn't coaching. You've it's some Californian wacky. Off you go. No, he's very big in the coaching world. He is very renowned for this, and I've sort of watched him do his stuff. And I suppose I've reached a place in my coaching where there's certain maturity to my coaching, where I'm more accepting of notions that initially were quite woo.
Yeah, well, you weren't keen on visualization when I first met you, so I've managed to win you round on that.
I had the same journey with somatics, and I think what's helped me with it is the neuroscience that sits behind it.
Yeah.
So even then, back then, I was exploring the concept and came across Antonio Damasio, who looked at somatic markers that we have in our body that will give us information. And so that made more sense to me because I could still connect it to the brain. It wasn't like I was ignoring what was going on in the brain, but there was definitely something coming up in the body, some awareness that started. That's probably our first indication that something's different, was this somatic marker. So that's my journey with it.
Whereas my journey was very integrated from the start. So when I went on my first coach training course, it was the embodiment work, the somatic work was very integrated with it. In fact, I did an intensive in-person event, and then we did continuing study for 6 months after that. And almost every evening we would do some somatic work around what we'd learned in the day. So how things felt in our body, but then also how we could utilise that mind-body connection in the other way to kind of find new ways of being. So it's always been an integral part of what I've done.
Yeah.
So I'm quite excited to talk this through with you today.
Good. So that might be useful to think about where it all started, the origins of it.
Yes.
And from a coaching perspective, it started during the 20th century with Wilhelm Reich and Moshe Feldenkrais.
Okay.
A mouthful. So Reich was a student of Freud's, and he explored that connection between emotional experiences and the body, what was going on, what was held in the body. So he described things that people held on to, emotions that people held on to, as character armour. So they would build up an armour around difficult emotions. So that was his offering. And Feldenkrais developed the Feldenkrais method, which was all about the structure and how we hold ourselves and posture and things like that. And then in the 70s, Thomas Hanna popularised the term somatics, emphasising that importance of body awareness and movement to try and achieve some holistic health. So that's kind of the start of it, and that laid the foundations for somatic coaching. And I think it was really Richard Strozzi Heckler who introduced that idea of somatics within coaching. I think it probably existed in other ways, and we'll talk about that, but I think he was the first one to actually call it somatic coaching. Okay. But to say for him, it was definitely a Californian way of life of you had to practice Aikido.
And to be clear, we don't need to practice Aikido every day in order to do somatic coaching.
No.
Okay, that's good.
And I think that was a bit of a relief to realise that. Because I got to that point of his book and went, well, this is rubbish then, isn't it? I'm never going to do that. Why? Let's forget this altogether. Which, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but that was my reaction to it. For God's sake.
I think there's definitely power in having a connection with your body and doing body movement exercises where you're really understanding where you are in the space that you occupy and having that connection. So yoga, tai chi, qigong, that type of exercise, so that you foster a better relationship with your body and with your understanding of how things feel. And I think that sort of adds to your inner resources.
Yes, and I definitely think a lot of people that are engaged in things like yoga will come to coaching. They'll be attracted to coaching as a discipline that they want to explore. So I think both from the point of view of maybe a yoga instructor coming to coaching and learning to coach and then using movement and body work in their coaching, then that makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. But also from the point of view of having coachees in the room, a lot of our coachees might be into yoga, and so to ignore the somatic element of coaching would be a mistake, I think.
Yes.
We have to have some awareness of it. And obviously for Richard Strozzi Heckler, that's his offering. It feels a little bit prescriptive that you have to do it that way. But I think at the same time, he puts that out there to the world. People who are interested in that way of being will buy into it and get something from it. Mm. I think if we're just offering more general coaching and using it integrating it within our coaching, then we're going to be responding to whatever's going on for our coachee up to a point.
Yeah.
I think it's still useful to introduce it, even if they've shown no interest in it at all.
I think so. Absolutely. I think it's, it's like everything, isn't it? Let's explore this and see what it brings. And some people will connect with it even without an expectation or like you wanting to go, that's a load of nonsense. No. But let's just give it a go. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. And I had an incident how long ago is this? Probably 12 years ago, where I was doing some consultancy work, and part of my role was to fire someone, just get rid of them. So I had to see him off the premises, and there was a point where he turned back. He put his briefcase in the boot of his car and turned back, came towards me, and was effing and blinded. And I kind of in my head, I was calculating, how quickly can I move to avoid a punch if it comes my way? So there was obviously a certain amount of stress involved in that incident. And I drove home at the end of the day. So that was at the end of the day, but I drove home. It's a 45-minute drive home. I couldn't get out of the car when I got home. My back was locked up. So there was something about the stress of that. And I didn't have a bad back, but there's something about the stress that I was holding on to that day that I really struggled with. So that's an indication that none of it is in isolation, is it? We can't be doing the thinking that we're doing and interacting in the way that we are without it having an impact on our bodies.
Yes.
So that idea that Reich had of that character armour, that there are things that we hold on to, that we retain in our bodies, that I think it's useful to explore.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that in practices like yoga, there can often be an emotional release. When people do start to relax their body, people can find themselves in tears and not really understand why. Yeah. And possibly the same in the coaching space there, to allow that to happen and to be processed in some way, at some level that we don't cognitively understand. Yeah.
I'm conscious that we've just talked about men in this world, the origins of it. So I just want to say there's a coach called Amanda Blake who does a lot of work in this arena. She was a student of Strozzi Heckler, but has carried on that exploration of somatic coaching. So she's perhaps someone to look out for if you've got particular interest in this arena.
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to my tutor on this one, because I worked with the absolutely gorgeous Susie Heath, who is very much an embodiment coach and a somatic coach. And she would lead our somatic sessions. And she's just such a beautiful person and embodies the art of embodied coaching. So there are lots of people out there doing good work.
And to be fair, you're doing good work in this area.
Well, thank you.
You're very welcome. And you do, and you don't call yourself a somatic coach. But
no.
Somatics is very much part and parcel of what you do.
Yes, it is, absolutely. And I think it's so important because my work is typically with women, and there's such a detachment for many women between their thinking and their bodies, and there's so much discussion that could be had around that. And I think it's so important for women to reconnect with their bodies and get back into their bodies and own the space that they take up in the world and not be afraid of that. And so I think somatic coaching and embodied coaching is really, really important for them.
Good. And obviously, we talk about somatic coaching as a particular type of coaching, but within our transformational coaching that we practice, we look at different approaches that use somatics. So Gestalt coaching uses the body. It's definitely about noticing what you're noticing and the coachee noticing what they're noticing about what's going on in their body, where they're feeling things. And actually, in terms of Gestalt, you might pick up on gestures that someone is making whilst they're talking about something. And you might ask them to exaggerate this, to talk about it again, but to exaggerate the gestures, just to bring it more into their awareness of what's going on for them. And then you might get them to, so if they, whilst they're talking about a conversation with a particular person, if they make themselves smaller, if their posture changes to make themselves smaller whilst they talk about it, you might, let's say, get them to scrunch up even tighter and talk about it again. Or you might get them to throw their shoulders back, stretch their arms out and talk about it again and to completely change their posture. So there's definitely that element in Gestalt of somatics.
And if you think about the cognitive behavioural approach and that hot cross bun model or the space model, whichever you prefer to call it, there's the physiological aspect. And quite often it's not just the physiology of the body, but the feelings in the body that people spot, they notice, their posture as well. And so that works really nicely in conjunction with cognitive behavioural.
And obviously Gestalt's been around since the 60s. Cognitive behavioural therapy, which we use in coaching, has been around since the 60s. So these aren't new things. And somatics has been around for centuries, hasn't it? But I think it's, if you have a bit, as I did initially, a bit of a resistance to being a somatic coach, then we can look at different approaches that use somatics. And it might be as simple as noticing someone's gestures or body language, when they talk about, and I've certainly used that to good effect, just to bring it to someone's awareness that, oh, I noticed when you talk about this, you did this. What does that mean?
Yeah.
But obviously the cognitive behavioural stuff, if we're looking at someone's thoughts and emotions and actions, but also then think about, okay, well, where do you hold that? Where does that exist?
And for me, I think in the cognitive behavioural element arena, tapping into physiology and being able to shift the physiology is often a quick hack, if you like, because it's easier perhaps to shift your posture than to shift your thinking in the moment, if you can remember to do either.
Yeah.
So I think somatics is sometimes a nice way in.
Yeah, we're big, I don't want to say advocates, but we're very interested in Amy Cuddy's work.
Yes.
And that whole idea of power posing and just changing your posture to bring about a different state. So I think that, again, feeds into this, that if we can ask someone to just adopt a different posture. So I've certainly done it with someone who was lacking confidence in the boardroom, and we talked about who he wanted to show up as, who he wanted to be like. He talked about Game of Thrones, one of the kings, and I got him to stand up and be that king from the Game of Thrones, and how he would be in the boardroom if he was that king. So there's a demonstration of somatics that he just embodied that character. Now, I'm sure he didn't do that in the boardroom, but there was something about the way that he raised himself up and opened his chest out. Now, if you can just bring some of that to your interactions, it's going to change things, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is something I do regularly with clients. And, you say, I'm sure he didn't do that in the boardroom, but I don't know. I'm not so sure. I have worked with people who've come back to coaching sessions and said, oh, Helen, it was amazing. I became, I stepped into Wonder Woman, or I stepped into this character that perhaps they'd created. And having practiced it in the coaching sessions, having practiced standing, walking, holding themselves in the style of that person, modelling those feelings and behaviours, that they were then able more easily to do that in the boardroom or in that difficult conversation. And, to say it's life-changing, I don't think would be an understatement. For many people, it's revelatory.
No, it's funny, the Amy Cuddy stuff. And I don't do power posing in the way that she suggested. Standing in a Wonder Woman or whatever pose you choose for 2 minutes would bring about some changes. But what I did take from that was, whenever I go to a new environment where I might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable, I don't sit down when I'm invited to sit down. Mm-hmm. So I went to the opticians a few weeks ago. Now, it's not terribly uncomfortable, but I've not been there before. So they just asked me to take a seat, and I stayed standing up, looking out of the window, watching the trees. And just, I'm more relaxed and more me, rather than if I'd sat down, I'd have got my phone out, I'd been hunched over my phone in a very submissive position, and changes the dynamics with whoever you're meeting. When they walk into the room, they're standing up, they're towering over you. You're being very submissive, aren't you? Yeah. So if you were going for an interview and were feeling a little bit nervous, that's just going to make you feel even more nervous. So my advice to anyone going for an interview or an important meeting where they're feeling a bit stressed about it is, don't sit down beforehand. Stay standing up. Even when someone says, take a seat, just, I'll stand.
And something that I do, I noticed the other day, we went into London, didn't we? And when I sit on tube trains, I use the whole seat. Like, women typically will huddle because if they've got a man sitting next to them, they are spreaders. And I'm like, do you know what? No, I'm going to take the whole seat. I'm going to take my space here. And it feels so different. And I just think that it's an interesting thing to play with. Have an explore of how it feels. Yeah. How it feels in your body, and then how that makes you think and feel in your mind when you do that. It's fascinating.
So back to coaching. So if we're not taking an entirely somatic approach and thinking about some of the areas that we might bring into coaching, so I think certainly that somatic awareness of making someone more aware, increasing that awareness of what's going on in their body and where perhaps certain feelings show up. So if they're talking about an emotion, well, where do you hold that emotion? Mm-hmm. And generally people will have an idea, and it will be different for different people. And we talked before on a podcast about Lisa Feldman Barrett and her work around emotions, that it's like an orchestra and different people will play different instruments in the orchestra. So for me, anxiety might mean I hold my breath. It could be all sorts of things. And we don't know what it is for them. So actually some exploration of it, raising their awareness of it, can be really useful. And I think going back to what we said earlier about Antonio Damasio's work, just those markers that tell us something. So we talk a lot about intuition, gut feeling, and there are definitely markers that when something happens and we get a feeling about something, it's useful information.
Absolutely.
That we need to pay attention to. We don't necessarily need to make a decision based on our gut feeling, but it could be part of our decision making.
Absolutely. So lots of benefits, lots of interesting ways that we can use somatic coaching or perform somatic coaching. If there was one technique that you might invite our coaches listening to this podcast to try, what might that be? I think that the gentlest way into it is just to notice what you're noticing to become more aware of what's going on for the coachee in front of you. So I coached someone a while ago who started playing with a necklace when she talked about something. And I just noticed that she was doing that and then stopped doing it when she stopped talking about it. And I asked her what that meant. So that's not really we're not asking them to use their body. We're noticing what they're doing with their body. So I think that noticing what you're noticing is the gentlest way into doing this. If we think about using a cognitive behavioral approach, asking where someone's feeling is held, where do you feel that? Now, what does it feel like? We talked about clean language on an earlier episode, and you might find a metaphor that comes up for them in terms of what's going on for them in their body. So again, I think that's worth exploring if they have that metaphorical landscape for whatever it is. Because quite often that is in relation to their body. They don't exist in isolation. No.
So there's a few gentle ways. Now, I know that you use much more somatics in your coaching. So what's the most powerful intervention that you would use?
The most powerful intervention, I would say, is to get people out of their seats. And, I know there are lots of coaches that do walking coaching and outdoor coaching, but even if we are on Zoom with someone, to get someone out of their seats and standing and exploring what things feel like, even if it's a habit, how does your body feel when you're about to do this thing? Or if it's something around perhaps confidence, how does your body feel when you go into that space? Go into that place now where you're feeling that way. And then we explore different ways of moving the body and how that changes people's feelings and thinking. And really looking for ways that we can play with it then when they go back into those spaces. So obviously it's not always as easy as this, but in that moment when you're about to go into that space, into that meeting, into that conversation, what one thing could you do that might shift the way you feel, the way you think? So really tapping into the body and getting people out of their seats and standing and exploring how perhaps they could shift their physicality to help them with what they want to achieve. And this often comes, yes, it's the mind-body connection, it's the inner wisdom, but it's also about who do I want to be? And if you want to be someone who isn't scared, is confident, takes up space in the world, whether that's in a leadership role or whatever role they take, almost they need permission to do that sometimes, and getting out of the seats and feeling it in that situations where it's safe to practice that with me. And as a coach, I go there with them. So I don't sit and watch the screen. If I get them out of their seats, I get out of their seats with them. And that's something I think that's really important. Come on, let's do this together. We're not going to experience the same things, but I'm going to go there with you. And that makes people feel more comfortable and psychologically safe to do that.
Yeah, they might feel a little bit awkward if you're just sat there watching them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do it with our groups, don't I? I run our workshop on that, and those people that have been through the programme will know that I get there and I step into that too.
Yeah, I don't run that programme at that workshop anymore because I used to sit and stare and laugh.
You did not.
No, I didn't. So wait a minute. But we'll leave it in. So obviously there are different ways that we can do this, and we've talked about the benefits of perhaps increasing someone's confidence by them acting more confident, so that connection between our actions and our thinking and our emotions and our physiology. What are the benefits, do you think, there are to using a somatic approach?
I think the benefits are far-reaching and more holistic, in all honesty. I think that they will, as with most of the work we do, ripple out into everything. If I think about the way I come out of a yoga or Pilates class, and I always say, I describe it as, being 10 foot tall. I walk taller, I walk differently. I interact with people differently. So I know that there is, when I work in a somatic way, there's an improvement in my sense of well-being. There's an improvement in my positive emotions. You become very much more in the moment. So there's a degree of mindfulness, stress relief. I could go on. There's so many benefits.
Obviously, mindfulness, it might well be a somatic intervention.
Yes.
You might do a body scan to get people in touch, become more aware of what's going on in their bodies.
Yeah.
And obviously breathing as well is so I think from a mental health perspective, from a well-being perspective, then obviously there are elements of somatics that will feed into that as well.
Yes, but I think it works both ways. So it feeds into it, but it's also an output, if you like. So yeah, lots of, and I think there's just something about becoming yourself. It's almost like when we disconnect from our bodies, we lose a part of ourselves, and when we can reconnect, I'm feeling quite emotional just saying that actually. When we reconnect with that part of ourselves, we become more whole and we become who we truly are.
And that links quite nicely back to Gestalt and the whole idea in Gestalt of us bringing about change by becoming more who we are. And part of that becoming more who we are is to recognise those, what they call in Gestalt, fixed Gestalts, which are creative adjustments that we've made to overcome difficult emotions or difficult feelings. So they get held in our body, and actually doing some work in a Gestalt way to unlock that. So say by changing postures, changing gestures, you might be able to unlock some of those fixed Gestalts that might allow us to become more who we are.
Yeah.
Good. What a nice way to round things off. We've done the Gestalt. It's a whole
Gestalt.
We've completed it. That's somatic coaching. Well, it's not. There is so much more that we could talk about in terms of somatic coaching, and maybe we'll do that on a future podcast, but we've made a start.
Yeah, it's a nice introduction if people have an interest.
Yeah.
And I hope you enjoyed that.
Good. Thank you very much. Next time on the podcast, we will be...
I think we're talking about a tool.
We're talking about a tool. And the tool we're talking about next time is the drama triangle. Comes from transactional analysis. So we'll give that a good airing next time.
Excellent. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Bye for now.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.